The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you, Ranking Member Blumenauer, subcommittee members, and our witnesses for being here today. I appreciate all of you taking the time to discuss the need for U.S. leadership in establishing and enforcing strong digital trade rules. Technology products are a crown jewel of American competitiveness. If our tech sector was its own country, its economy would be the 8th largest in the world, larger than even Canada or Russia. It employs 8.9 million Americans and pays 33% more than other industries on average. However, our status as an innovation powerhouse is under threat. In recent years, our strategic and economic rivals have sought to erode America's competitive edge through a series of discriminatory digital trade and tax measures targeting American companies. There is no question this is contrary to our national interest. This is why I was so concerned last October when the Biden administration announced it was no longer supporting core, bipartisan digital trade rules in negotiations at the World Trade Organization and the Indo-Pacific. A recent poll found 86% of American voters believe it's important for the U.S. to lead in writing global rules for technology. Yet, where we should be leading on technology rules, America is retreating. Where we should be arguing for our values in the face of digital authoritarians, we are silent. And where we should be working with allies, we are leaving like-minded partners out to dry. Even more concerning, it has been almost a year since USTR announced this policy change, yet the administration has gone radio silent on what our digital trade policy should look like. Predictably, WTO partners have moved on without the United States. At USTR's insistence, digital trade is also off the table in ongoing negotiations with Kenya, despite the chance to set a gold standard with this important partner and developing nation. At the same time, it seems like our administration is out to lunch as foreign governments treat American companies like a piggy bank by imposing new digital services taxes. It is unacceptable. Canada, one of our closest trading partners, is now collecting its DST with little response by the U.S. government. Make no mistake, the new USMCA dispute against Canada's DST is a positive step, but it is too little, too late. We should have been ready to act immediately when Canada proceeded unilaterally, blatantly ignoring a series of warnings from Congress and our executive branch. Fecklessness on trade enforcement signals to foreign governments that aiming trade barriers at U.S. firms is fair game. Look no further than the European Union, which continues its regulatory assault against American enterprise. For example, under the Digital Markets Act, 6 companies are designated for increased regulation as, quote, gatekeepers. 5 are American, 1 is Chinese, and none are European. The Digital Services Act similarly targets American innovators. Yet the Biden administration has turned its head the other way, and in some cases has even sent agency officials to assist the EU in implementing these laws. This sort of collusion to undermine American companies is simply unacceptable. Discriminatory actions against U.S. companies should be met with a firm response, not a helping hand. I'll close with this. America needs to return to the table. We need to get back to negotiating smart trade agreements that support our innovators, agreements with real teeth. Further, the U.S. government must have the will to enforce them. We need to make sure foreign governments know discriminatory actions will be met with a swift and decisive response from a government that supports its job creators. I now recognize Ranking Member Blumenauer for his opening statement.
Thank you. For planning and organizing today's hearings. I know it's been an incredibly demanding work period with everything that's going on, and I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us in the waning days of the fall session here. In the interest of time, I'll just briefly highlight a few topics that we'll hear about today. I would like to start by commending the Biden-Harris administration for their leadership role in the recent extension of the WTO e-commerce moratorium. The United States was instrumental in getting all WTO members to agree to the extension, and it was not, I'm told, an easy task. The e-commerce moratorium supports American business growth and is critical to the digital economy. Extending the e-commerce moratorium was a big priority for the Ways and Means Committee. As the chairman mentioned, the digital economy is critically important to the United States. According to the most recent data, as is mentioned, there's a tremendous amount of value that is involved with this, 10% of the GDP. And the digital economy grew at over 7% per year from 2017 to 2022. The impressive growth for the digital economy has created new opportunities for workers, for consumers, and business. The digital economy has enabled entrepreneurs like Dr. Walch, one of our panelists, to start small business that operate globally. It has led to the introduction of new technologies and platforms that have helped to drive even more innovation, improve trade facilitation, and further conservation efforts, and provide important access to telemedicine. Today, the digital economy touches most industries, whatever size. But while the digital economy has created new opportunities and transformed certain industries, it's raised significant modern challenges. As Ambassador Tai has correctly noted, an increasingly digital and digitalized economy challenge every realm of our individual and collective experience and requires careful consideration of the regulatory approach. On the one hand, we must create conditions for companies to innovate, and yet on the other hand, we must ensure the ability of governments to regulate the digital economy, especially with respect to personal data. In this regard, I'm looking forward to hearing from Eric Gottwald today on some of these challenges, both within the workplace, such as surveillance of workers, and outside the workplace, such as the erosion of personal privacy. I am concerned about that and look forward to hearing from our panelists. Finally, I'll close by noting that policymakers have an obligation to approach digital trade policy thoughtfully and deliberately. We need to strike an appropriate balance, furthering the growth of the U.S. digital economy and responding to the needs of our citizens and not having them shortchanged. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these issues. I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, your convening us and look forward to a productive conversation.
Thank you to Ranking Member Blumenauer. Appreciate your participation as well. I'd like to introduce our witnesses now. First, we'll have Robert Atkinson. He's president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We have Olivia Walch, who is chief executive officer of Arcascope. We have Evangelos Razis, and he is the senior manager of Workday. We have Adrian Shahbaz, who is vice president of research and analysis for Freedom House. And then we also have Eric Gottwald, who is policy specialist on trade and economic globalization for the AFL-CIO. Each of you will have 5 minutes. You'll have your timer there that you can see. Once you see that yellow light, if you could bring the flight in for a smooth landing, we would all appreciate that. So Dr. Atkinson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Blumenauer and members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to speak with you today about this key issue that you laid out. What's undeniable is that the U.S. leads in this sector. We have 37% of global market share in the IT and information services market. And it's an incredibly valuable market in the sense, as you noted, pays high wages, key exports. And that is why so many foreign governments, including core allies like Canada, like Korea, and others, have targeted this sector, targeted our businesses, both in a form of digital protectionism so that they can grow their businesses. If they can hobble ours, they think they can grow their businesses to compete with ours, but also direct digital aggression, limiting our ability to do business, taking our business company money. And we detail in my testimony a number of key areas, and it's striking just how aggressive these areas are. Number one, and as people talked about, limiting cross-border data flows. Number two, government-driven import substitution, where governments like the European government are saying, we don't want to buy your IT services or cloud services, we want our own. And yet Europe is running a $200 billion trade surplus with us, and we're running a $2 billion trade surplus in digital with them. So essentially, they have 100 times more trade surplus with us in other areas than we do in digital, and they won't even let us sell digital products and services to them, which is what they want to do. Cloud center localization. You can't have your cloud data center has to be there. Mandated edge provider payments to ISPs. Basically, what they're doing over there is their ISPs, their telecom companies, are saying, hey, we have a good idea to raise money. We'll just force Amazon and Google and these other companies to just pay us money. This is a complete violation of how the internet has always worked. Digital standards manipulation. Rather than relying on the global voluntary standards process that we've had for decades, a lot of these countries are imposing their own standards as a way to get competitive advantage. Digital services taxes. Mr. Smith, you mentioned that, Congressman Smith. What's important to understand that those don't come from the companies. They come from our Treasury. These companies that pay that get a tax credit against their U.S. taxes. So they're just taking tax money from U.S. taxpayers. Aggressive antitrust against these companies. Massive fines, particularly the Europeans. Billions and billions of dollars of fines. The highest fines we've ever seen anywhere for antitrust. Taxing streaming platforms. And giving the money to domestic companies. And finally, arbitrary privacy enforcement, bringing privacy cases that would never stand in the U.S. against American companies. So in light of all that, it is critical that we need strong pushback against these countries. And it's unfortunate that USTR-TI made that decision to pull out of the WTO negotiations and others to get, quote, policy space. And I just want to close by saying that really is not what is at stake here. Congress has the ability to do virtually anything in regulating the digital policy space, virtually anything, as long as it doesn't discriminate in favor of American companies against foreign companies. So we could pass an AI bill if we wanted to, and it wouldn't change anything about our need to push back against foreign countries that are using AI regulation to discriminate against American companies. We could pass, and we should pass, a national privacy bill. That would not at all preclude us from pushing back against cross-border data limitations. And one of the key points that I think is lost in this debate, regulation flows with the data. The idea that if you move data offshore, you no longer have to comply with the regulatory standards of that country is just false. The Canadian government brought a case a few years ago against an American company that was doing business in Canada and the U.S. It took Canadian person data, put it into the U.S., and complied with U.S. law. Unfortunately, it broke the Canadian law. Canadians sued the company, and they won in court, as they rightly should have, because the American company violated the laws of the country they were doing business. So cross-border data flows do not mean that you can have a get-out-of-jail-free card. Let me just close by saying this is such an important sector, as you noted, that if we don't take stronger action, we're going to lose this sector. And we're going to lose the jobs and the revenue and the exports that come with it. So I would, again, I'm so pleased that you're doing this hearing because it's such a critical issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Walch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Olivia Walch, and I'm the CEO and founder of Arcascope, a Virginia-based company that makes software to help people sleep better by targeting their circadian rhythms. If you've ever experienced jet lag, worked a night shift, or simply woken up in the middle of the night and not known why, you've experienced the tremendous impact that circadian rhythms can have on your sleep, health, and overall well-being. Our apps work by telling users what they need to do through personalized plans for timing their eating, light exposure, and caffeine to start sleeping and feeling better faster. In the time since our founding, we've had success helping users sleep better all across the United States, but our users are not just in the United States, and it's for that reason that I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. Arcascope has users from countries around the world. Like most small companies, we reach these users through an infrastructure of service providers for distribution, authentication, analytics, and each of these handle user data. The services range from as critical as handling how a user logs in to as simple as just tracking if they clicked a button. We've invested time, energy, and effort into engineering our backend to carefully handle this data. We can't afford to constantly re-engineer this backend or consult our lawyer in response to policy changes requiring us to store data locally or pay country-specific tariffs. We just lack the resources. After all, 2 weeks of my lawyer's time is half an engineer's salary. If we were in a position where the choice was between redoing our back end or leaving a country whose specific rules were a compliance challenge, we would almost certainly just stop operating in that country. And of course, you can see the problem this poses for a jet lag app. You don't want to take off from Dulles and not have your app work in Delhi. We already limit the data we collect because of compliance headaches. If you land in Delhi and you want to know why we're telling you not to drink coffee, I can't tell you without having you go to settings and export a diagnostic report and email it to us, which is a hassle, and it's caused by disparate regulations we encounter around the globe. If the fracturing of digital trade is allowed to continue, I'm confident that established third-party providers will sell us compliance for a price, passing their costs on to us and further entrenching the already big players in the technology space. Compliance with countless nation-specific digital trade laws takes a lot of lawyers, and there aren't that many companies with lawyers at the scale of Meta, Google, Amazon. We are not one of those. I want to briefly touch on the e-commerce moratorium, source code disclosure, and data flows with my remaining time. Digital goods are essentially information, which makes them inherently different from trade and physical goods, and I'm grateful for the WTO e-commerce moratorium in place right now, which makes it so that digital goods are not subject to tariffs in the same way physical goods are. And it's from this place of gratitude that I call for strong US leadership to continue the moratorium and ultimately make it permanent. As a startup, putting our proprietary innovations at risk is putting our entire company at risk. Requirements to share source code as part of operating in a country would mean exposing our secret sauce to foreign regulators that probably don't have our best interests in mind. Our only option would again be to stop operating in a country that demanded that. And it's easy to see how the imposition of localization requirements would be stifling to products like our jet lag app, but almost any business would be disrupted by barriers to cross-border data flows. And despite the tendency to think of tech as nice to haves, like social media or streaming services, data flows can be critical and life-sustaining. My company's ambitions go far beyond jet lag app. We're the first mover in the field of consumer chronomedicine, timing drugs so that they are maximally effective and minimally toxic, drugs like chemotherapy. We work with researchers around the world, and we need to be able to share data with each other. Innovation will happen fastest if barriers to data flows across borders are kept as frictionless as possible. There are good reasons for slowdowns in sharing of health data to occur, like rigorous human subjects and privacy protections. But inconsistent, nation-specific trade bureaucracy is not one of them. US small businesses like mine need strong leadership to prevent rules like tariffs on digital goods, mandatory data localization, and forced source code disclosure from hampering our global growth. With strong leadership on digital trade from the United States, companies like Arcascope can continue to do what we do best, which is build and compete on a global stage. And we can continue to help you avoid jet lag on your next congressional delegation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Razis. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Evangelos Razis, and I'm Senior Manager of Public Policy at Workday, where I lead our policy efforts on data flows, privacy, and AI. Workday is a leading provider of enterprise cloud applications for finance and HR. Our software is used by more than 10,000 organizations around the world and across industries, including more than 60% of the Fortune 500. There are 70 million workers in the Workday customer community, and nearly 30% of all US job openings are processed using our software. I commend the subcommittee for its bipartisan focus on strong digital trade rules and would like to offer 3 points for my written testimony. First, digital trade rules are vital for cross-border data flows, which Workday and our customers rely on to grow, innovate, and do business. Workday can develop AI-powered solutions here in the United States and deliver them to our customers wherever they are in the world.
Mr. Razis, could you pull your microphone a little closer? Thank you.
Enterprises in every major industry, from manufacturing to retail to financial services, rely on our software platform to recruit, manage, train, and empower their employees, complete payroll, process benefits, and manage their finances. Unfortunately, barriers to the free flow of information and digital services exports are growing abroad. For cloud software companies like Workday and our customers, data localization requirements are particularly challenging. Unlike legacy systems, cloud software like Workday runs on third-party infrastructure and is delivered through the internet. Customers get the benefit of our software without having to purchase, install, update, and manage it. This business model was pioneered in the United States, and it enables companies in every sector of the economy to access innovative new technologies, including AI, securely and at scale. Second, strong digital trade rules complement and don't preempt smart regulations. Workday sees incredible opportunities for technology to unlock human potential. But we also recognize that people won't use technology they don't trust. For this reason, we support robust privacy protections. And whether it's federal privacy reforms or comprehensive state privacy laws, one thing is clear: no leading US privacy framework runs afoul of strong digital trade rules, because they don't impose the kinds of data localization requirements and data transfer restrictions that digital trade rules target. Workday also supports smart regulation on high-risk uses of AI. We've endorsed legislation here in Congress that would advance meaningful AI governance. As with privacy, AI frameworks like the first-in-the-nation Colorado AI Act don't violate digital trade rules. Why? Because they don't require foreign companies to transfer source code as a condition for doing business. Put differently, we don't face a choice of strong digital trade rules, rigorous privacy protections, or smart AI regulation. We can and we should choose all of the above. Third, far from undermining domestic regulations, strong digital trade rules support global regulatory cooperation and better protect consumers. Under the USMCA and the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, which are the gold standards, governments commit to having laws that protect privacy and address fraudulent and deceptive practices online. At a time when trade barriers are erected in the name of privacy, cybersecurity, and other policy aims, digital trade rules advance a vision of a trustworthy and open economy. Like many, we were surprised by USTR's decision last year to withdraw support for strong digital trade rules at the WTO. US leadership sets the tone around the world on data policy, and USTR's decision cedes crucial ground on a growing number of trade barriers abroad. In closing, I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. Workday, as well as our customers and their employees, benefit greatly from US leadership in this space. As you chart a way forward on digital trade, the subcommittee can consider us a partner and ally in its efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Razis. Mr. Shahbaz.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to testify before you today. My name is Adrian Shahbaz. I'm the Vice President for Research at Freedom House. We are a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization founded in 1941. Our mission is to protect and expand freedom around the world. I'm grateful to this subcommittee for elevating the human rights angle of digital trade. The protection of fundamental freedoms is necessary for upholding a rule of law system that protects innovation and enables both prosperity and security. My remarks will draw on Freedom House's annual Freedom on the Net report, which assesses internet freedom in over 70 countries. We work with local experts to produce country reports and scores on obstacles to access, limits on content, and rights violations. The project is widely used by public and private sectors to understand global regulatory developments, assess operational and human rights risks, and set internal priorities and policies. And let me say, we've been honored to have members of Congress from both sides of the aisle provide opening remarks at our report launches. A free and open internet is crucial, not only for political participation and free expression, but also for commerce, healthcare, and education. With the right tools, a school teacher in my father's home country of Afghanistan can access the same information and learning platforms as a student in Washington, D.C. This is due to the way that the internet is run as a global, decentralized network where information and data flow across borders. But authoritarian governments are on a campaign to change that, and in their own countries and on the international stage, we see increased moves to divide the global internet into national networks that are more easily controlled. For these reasons, we expressed concern 1 year ago when the United States Trade Representative dropped support for cross-border data flows at the World Trade Organization. The decision risks further fragmenting the global internet by emboldening authoritarian governments to enact data localization laws. These laws require companies and other service providers to store data about local residents on servers within the country. And while they are often passed under the premise of growing the digital economy or protecting users' privacy, research has shown that data localization can actually hinder growth and impair cybersecurity tools. Our own research has found that these laws can have negative implications for people's freedoms, particularly in countries that are ranked partly free and not free in our annual report. That is because data localization laws are often used to force companies to comply with local security agencies, including to censor nonviolent political, social, and religious speech, and to hand over personal data. One of the clearest examples is China, which has received the worst score in our Net Freedom Index for 9 consecutive years. Vague provisions in several laws mandate that the companies collect and store their data within China's borders, and that companies assist the Chinese government with national security and intelligence efforts. Given China's dismal human rights record, these laws put companies at a high risk of complicity with serious human rights abuses. The Chinese Communist Party considers all sorts of nonviolent political, social, and religious expression as a threat to national security, and we know that they rely on technology companies to conduct mass surveillance of Uyghurs and other persecuted ethnic and religious communities. Chinese officials have also partnered with Russia to reshape global cyber norms at the United Nations and other fora. They seek to make the world safe for authoritarianism by affirming their right to curtail the political rights and civil liberties of their own people, online and off. If global norms shift further away from a freedom and openness, there is a risk that data localization laws will proliferate. Companies in authoritarian countries will face increased demands to comply with human rights abuses, and billions of people around the world will become less free. The United States plays a critical role in preserving a free flow of information and data across borders, a necessary condition not only for the protection of freedom, but for advancing innovation, prosperity, and security. To ensure the United States continues its leadership role, Congress should, 1, urge the executive branch to advance the goals outlined in the U.S. International Cyberspace and Digital Policy Strategy, namely to, quote, develop shared mechanisms that will help maintain an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable internet, as well as trusted cross-border data flows, end quote. Second, continue to provide funding for digital tools and assistance programs in countries where civic space is closed or rapidly closing, so that people can access independent sources of information and protect themselves against unwarranted and disproportionate surveillance by their governments. And third, pass legislation to improve transparency across technology products and practices in the United States, including content moderation and recommendation systems, as well as the collection and use of data. It is essential for the United States and other democracies to promote an alternative model to digital authoritarianism through both our foreign and domestic policies. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Shahbaz. Mr. Gottwald, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. I'm here on behalf of the AFL-CIO and the more than 12.5 million union members who work in every state and every sector of our economy. Too often, the digital trade discussion sounds like it has no grounding in the physical world. It is buzzwords like internet-enabled commerce, big data, cloud computing. It is all those things, but we should not lose sight of the fact that decisions about abstract things like global data flows, algorithms, and artificial intelligence have profound implications for workers around the world. While the digital transformation has driven real gains in communications, transportation, science, and beyond, it has also brought urgent challenges to the world of work. For example, open global data flows have enabled the offshoring of tens of thousands of good call center and back office jobs to places like India and the Philippines with low pay and poor working conditions. Major platforms like Facebook and TikTok have outsourced content moderation work to developing nations where hundreds of thousands of so-called ghost workers spend long days tagging and coding off offensive images and other content. Digital trade also powers the algorithmic management software that increasingly hires, evaluates, monitors, and even fires workers here in the United States. These technologies can shortchange workers' earnings, expose workers to unsafe work conditions on the job, and infringe on the right to form unions, and exacerbate employment discrimination. All these workers are directly impacted by global digital commerce on the job, but they are also impacted at home. Big tech companies collect, combine, and commodify vast troves of personal data that compromises everyone's security and privacy. Our personal data is sold and resold by unaccountable data brokers to entities in Russia, China, and beyond. Meanwhile, the algorithms that power social media have pushed online hate, political disinformation, and harmed the mental health of young people. Unfortunately, at a time when we need Congress to regulate the digital economy, the USMCA digital language fits more like a straitjacket than a well-tailored suit. For example, under these rules, governments may not enact any measures that restrict cross-border data flows, with no exception for sensitive forms of personal information. In addition, there's an absolute ban on data localization policies, even for legitimate purposes, like ensuring that citizens' sensitive medical or financial information is kept onshore. Supporters of these severe disciplines point to the agreement's legitimate public policy exception to reassure policymakers that they have retained their full right to regulate. But upon closer examination, this simply isn't the case. The public policy exception is taken directly from existing WTO agreements where it has proven to be largely ineffective. Just fewer than 5% of challenged government policies have been upheld by trade dispute panels. We are alarmed that bipartisan efforts to protect personal data and address big tech's anti-competitive practices could run afoul of these digital trade rules. This debate cannot be framed as a binary choice between China's Great Firewall and a totally unregulated global data marketplace where anything goes. It is time for a strategic reset to ensure that our digital trade policy strikes the right balance between promoting open data flows and securing data privacy and workers' rights. Congress must be free to act to protect Americans' data privacy and advance our economic and national security interests, even if those measures happen to restrict open global data flows. Congress must preserve the ability of regulators to meaningfully oversee the use of artificial intelligence management software in the workplace to ensure that it is consistent with our current labor and employment laws. And we must enact new laws to address emerging issues such as electronic workplace surveillance and the erosion of digital privacy. The Congress and the public should decide the rules of the road for technology in the workplace and society. That cannot be left up to big tech companies and unaccountable international trade tribunals. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gottwald. Thank you to our entire panel. I think we have a great variety of perspectives here that I think are important to include. It cannot be overstated how important this topic is. So thank you for sharing your perspectives and your insight. I think one of the coolest things about digital issues, digital technology, is that it has been, I think, a great equalizer in so many different ways. When we see technology, perhaps the backbone from a larger company, but it's a launching pad for a small operation. So Dr. Walch, I don't know how many employees you have, but I'm guessing you started out smaller than you are now, and that many, many other companies have as well. I might say that, American digital services, or digital services that originate in our country, allow, they provide a launching pad for other small operations around the world too. So it's discouraging that other countries, other jurisdictions would even want to restrict that when perhaps they're conceivably harming their own population. But getting more specific here, I know that 2 years ago, we as a country engaged with Kenya, well, actually before that as well, launching negotiations for what is called the Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership. So at that time, USTR highlighted digital trade as a key priority in the negotiations. However, digital trade has kind of dropped off of that discussion. I find that particularly concerning. But Dr. Atkinson and Mr. Shahbaz, what would you say about what I would think is a missed opportunity here, especially when you look at opportunities across the continent of Africa and the capacity that they can bring to the entire arena of international trade? And I'm just wondering if you could share your perspective on that.
Thank you. The ITIF just released a big report up here in Capitol on Wednesday, looking at how innovative Chinese firms are and what the competition we face with China. And one of the main battlegrounds for that competition, including in the digital space, is going to be in places like Africa, South America, parts of Asia. And so I think we have to think about Africa as a battleground. This is similar to how we thought about it in the Cold War. We were vigilant to make sure that African countries didn't go and side with the Soviets. So by walking away from digital trade engagement, I think we're opening the door to the Chinese. They are spending billions and billions of dollars in African countries to get them to adopt the kinds of systems we heard about, the surveillance systems and others. So if we don't engage with countries like Kenya, I really worry that they're just going to default to a country like China that's much more enabling and supportive of what they're doing.
Thank you. Mr. Shahbaz.
Thank you for the question. I would say, Africa is an incredibly diverse continent, and you have democracies and autocracies there. I would echo what Dr. Atkinson said here, that when we've interviewed several experts and those who are engaged in the fight for freedom and for digital freedoms on the continent, what they have shared is their fear, essentially, around data localization laws, that if more governments are passing data localization laws, that will put their very sensitive information closer to the hands of security agencies. And this information reveals one's political opinions, one's religious beliefs, also sensitive information about our health, our connections, and it's essentially a threat to privacy. So what we've wanted to see happen is for the United States to offer an alternative to the digital authoritarian model that the Chinese government has been promoting on the continent. They have been undergoing trainings and investments throughout the continent. I think it's important that the United States approach not only favors the free flow of information and data, but then also works with civil society and with government to make sure that the operating system of democratic governance is actually there in place to make sure that whatever rules or technologies that are then brought in these countries is essentially under the oversight of the people, because we essentially believe that democracy is the most important technology here that many of these societies need in order to make sure that that technology is used to promote freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Atkinson, I know that there's been criticism of strong digital trade rules, saying that there's a concern about the right to regulate, perhaps, for our country to regulate. Do you think that there are any provisions in our trade agreements that would prevent Congress from passing new legislation on topics such as artificial intelligence or data privacy?
There absolutely are not. I would disagree with what Mr. Gottwald said. He mentioned, for example, open data flows lead to offshoring. That's about U.S. policy. That's not about, if we wanted to not do that, we could. Digital trade leads to employee oversight. No. Employee oversight, which oftentimes is a good thing, is about a domestic issue. If you want to regulate how technologies monitor their employees, you have every right to do that. It's not going to violate any trade agreement. Privacy. Again, I go back to this key point. We can and should have a national privacy bill, but it doesn't mean that a company doing business here can't move the data to a server or a cloud center in Ottawa or in Montreal. There's nothing there's nothing that makes that that impedes what you want to do. The only thing that would impede what you want to do is if you decide you want to, if Congress wants to put in place laws that intentionally discriminate against foreign companies. That's what you cannot do. That's the tie that binds, if you will. So no, Congress could easily pass AI rules as long as the AI rules and regulations don't discriminate against foreign AI companies in favor of American AI companies. But if you want to pass a law that says that AI has to have special privacy rules, or that algorithms have to be disclosed, or whatever you might want to do, you can do that.
Thank you. I'll now move to Mr. Blumenauer as ranking member for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shahbaz, in your testimony, you say it's essential for the United States and like-minded allies to offer an alternative to the authoritarian model of digital governance. We should better safeguard people's rights and data while still protecting the global internet. And you identify a half dozen specifics. Can you elaborate on what the one or two priorities would be to be able to accomplish that objective?
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think it's one where the United States has made progress over the past several administrations. So I would just point to the longstanding bipartisan support for global internet freedom programs, which have really made a difference throughout the African continent as well as around the world to provide people with greater access to information. Congress funds programs that provide virtual private networks and other types of circumvention tools that allow for people in closed environments to, let's say, jump the censorship of their local government and prevent their activity from being under close surveillance. So I would say that promoting circumvention tools is one aspect of that. A second part is what I alluded to, which is a more democratic model for digital governance. So what we're seeing around the world is that China, Russia, Iran, other authoritarian governments are privileging a state-centric view of how the internet should be run. And that goes against the fundamental multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. There are conversations that are happening right now as we speak around internet governance. There's a UN cybercrime treaty that is deeply troubling. It has certain provisions that are deeply troubling that would allow for authoritarian governments to collaborate by sharing data about people who are suspected of crimes in their countries. So there's quite a bit that the United States should also be doing multilaterally. I would say a fundamental point here is really the support for civil society, because what distinguishes democracy and what the United States is doing from what China is doing is working not only with governments or with security agencies to protect countries and protect national security, but it's also working with civil society organizations in a lot of these countries to make sure that they have a voice at the table. And we've seen that pay dividends when many countries have introduced legislation for data localization requirements. It's been actually civil society organizations that have been at the table raising a ruckus locally through the media, through conversations with legislators there, to then push back against very far-reaching laws that would essentially cut the countries off from the rest of the global internet. Thank you.
No, thank you. Mr. Gottwald, in your testimony, you noted that employers are increasingly included automated systems to monitor or discipline workers, largely without the input of workers or their unions. I hope we could get a little more granular in terms of what this means and how we can speak out and take action to protect the rights of workers. We took a CODEL to Colombia looking at the implementation of our FTA and dealing with call centers. It seemed to me that there's some gaps here that we might be able to do something with. Would you elaborate on your point?
Thanks for that question. If we step back, I think everybody has recognized since the pandemic hit and telework became more and more popular, there's a lot more awareness about the deployment by employers of these digital workplace surveillance tools. Some of these are quite creepy, to be candid with you. If you're working from home and your employer is monitoring not just keystrokes, but potentially even using the camera to biometrics and things, and it's a little disturbing. So I can understand why Congress is focused on this. Utterly appropriate. I'll just say that in our experience, workers are almost never aware that this software is being deployed by the employer. Sometimes the trade unions, if there is a trade union, are unaware of it as well. Although I'll say this, our trade unions are more and more making this subject of use of AI management software or surveillance software part of collective bargaining. And I think that's a very positive trend. I think that it influences the workplace so profoundly. And workers need to know what kind of data is being collected by the employer, and what's being done with that data. Is it being sold and shared, resold? I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. I'm glad you mentioned the call center workers. They face special challenges. We've heard from organized call center workers that employers sometimes use this quality monitoring software, which is fine, but what will happen in practice is it will punish people with non-native English speakers. They speak English well enough, but their accent, they might have a slight accent this way or that way, and they're probably well understood by the person on the other side of the line, but the software is knocking them for having an accent that's a little bit outside the box.
Thank you.
The last thing I'd say is in Colombia, that company, I believe was Teleperformance, large French company that does a lot of outsourcing work for call centers for the big tech companies. That Teleperformance company has a horrible track record on workers' rights. A complaint was filed by French unions at the OECD, really laying out the challenges in this area. And Mr. Blumenauer, I can follow up in written remarks to give more flavor there.
I would appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll now move to Mr. LaHood, followed by Mr. Kildee. After Mr. Kildee, we'll move, as is tradition, 2 to 1 for the questions. Mr. LaHood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this important hearing today. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your really valuable testimony here today on a very important topic. In our increasingly interconnected world, the trade of digital goods and services is essential for American growth, innovation, and global leadership. Digital trade is more than buying and selling of goods online. It encompasses a global flow of data, ideas, and talent. In 2022, digital trade encompassed more than $2.5 trillion of U.S. economic activity and represents the fastest growing segment of global trade. As the co-chair of the Digital Trade Caucus here in Congress, I'm increasingly concerned about the proliferation of restrictive and oftentimes discriminatory digital regulatory frameworks and laws which risk curtailing American digital competitiveness. In recent years, we have seen close trading partners, including Canada, Australia, Korea, and the EU, enact regulatory frameworks or levy digital service taxes that risk unfair treatment of American businesses. While laws like the EU's Digital Marketing Act, the DMA, or Digital Services Act, DSA, are intended to create a fairer digital landscape and simulate domestic competition, in practice, they often discriminate against U.S. companies, posing challenges that stifle innovation and competition. I think it's also important to remember the U.S. leads the world in technology. We lead the world in digital competition. We need to be much more aware of that when we look at what Europe and a number of other countries are doing. In 2023, the European Commission identified 6 gatekeeper platforms to be subject to regulation under the DMA or face fines equating to more than 10% of their global revenues. Of those 6 companies, 5 are American and 1 is Chinese. Isn't that ironic that none of the ones that are headquartered in Europe were a part of that? In my view, efforts to regulate these American companies can and will lead to a chilling effect, discouraging further U.S. investment in Europe. In fact, a newly released report from the European Commission on the future of EU competition notes that the complexity and risks associated with the EU's regulatory approach may undermine developments in emerging technologies like AI and quantum computing. Further, I and many others have been critical of the Biden administration's failure to promote a strong alternative that advances American digital trade interests abroad with our like-minded allies and trading partners. Instead, this administration continues to send mixed messages by walking back long-held bipartisan and really nonpartisan digital trade proposals as outlined by the WTO, pushing a narrative that encourages these discriminatory digital frameworks to flourish. And that's troubling. I'll get to my question here. Dr. Atkinson, given the ongoing regulatory approach by the EU, is it possible to find common ground with our counterparts in Europe in terms of digital trade? If so, what tools should Congress consider to address these regulatory challenges?
Well, Congressman, you alluded to what is known now as the Draghi report that just came out, former president of Italy. Very important report because for the first time, there's a high-level recognition that Europe is shooting itself in the foot with these policies. So whether that really changes or not, I don't know. I am very skeptical that we can get agreement or even close the gap with the Europeans absent being tough. I think the Europeans understand they can get away with this, and they've been getting away with it constantly. And there's been no pushback, there's been no penalties. In fact, we've engaged with the Tech and Trade Council and have these conversations. There's no penalties. So I think the Europeans, as a rational actor, would say, yeah, why not? Let's keep punishing American companies. Let's keep taking their money. I mean, they can fund, I'm kind of exaggerating, they can fund the European Commission budget just off the fines of American companies. So I think the only way to do that is to say there will be consequences if you keep doing this. We could bring a 301 case, for example. We could penalize them on other areas. I lay that out in my testimony. So I think absent getting tough, they're just not going to respond.
The bottom line is we have many tools in the toolbox to put deterrents in place and hold the Europeans accountable. Is that fair?
We have many tools in the toolbox. We could add a few more. Yes, that is absolutely, I would agree with that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Kildee from Michigan.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Blumenauer, and especially thanks to the witnesses for being here for this really important conversation. Many of us on this committee and the Biden-Harris administration, by the way, have been committed to creating a fairer playing field for American workers to compete in the global and increasingly digital economy. One way to help workers stay competitive, of course, is by ensuring that U.S. international trade agreements specifically uphold workers' rights. Our agreements that cover digital trade should not be any different. We need strong, enforceable labor standards in these agreements to avoid the inevitable race to the bottom when it comes to the treatment of workers. This could mean enshrining internationally recognized worker rights by outlined in the ILO's Declaration of Fundamental Rights and Principles at Work, as well, and importantly, creating monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, as we've seen in other trade agreements. So, Mr. Gottwald, coming back to you, and you've made mention of some of this, both in your written testimony and in answers to questions here, but I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on what these labor standards that I suggest and others have might look like, and if you have examples, model examples of such standards that might already exist. Could you comment?
Thank you, Representative Kildee. Yeah, this is a great question. If we look at the digital economy, it was mentioned before, it is now, it's sort of bled into the normal economy. It's kind of, the line is not clear what's digital, what's not anymore. I think everybody knows that. So if we look at the US-Japan agreement, for example, that was a standalone digital agreement. The problem from our point of view is that if you look at the text, there's nowhere in the text does it say worker, labor rights, anything, because it's a standalone deal. So I think certainly for these standalone deals, USTR needs to develop some clear labor standards and benchmarks. Much of that, as you mentioned, can be borrowed from our existing trade deals, and based on these 1998 ILO fundamental principles and rights, right? And these principles and rights, by the way, this is the baseline, right? This is the baseline of respect for workers: no child labor, no forced labor, the right to organize a union, right to be free from discrimination at work. I mean, these are the rules that everybody's already agreed to play by at the ILO. So, totally appropriate to put those in there and have all the parties to these digital trade deals agree that they're going to uphold these rules, including with workers in the digital sector and the services sector. That's really critical. I would also say that, to your point on monitoring enforcement, I think we need to get a little more creative on monitoring enforcement for the services sector and the digital trade sector. USMCA, with the rapid response mechanism, huge leap forward, tremendously effective for targeting employers and facilities who are benefiting from USMCA shipping goods across the border. Bit more challenging with services and digital, right? Because sometimes it's not goods going across the border, it's data. But smart people over at USTR, smart people in Congress, we can figure it out, and I appreciate you raising it.
Well, thank you for that. I wonder if I could just quickly turn to the issue of digital services taxes. We know that there's a discriminatory DST implemented by Canada in June. Mr. Atkinson, I'd ask you to comment. Congressman Estes and I have been working together on this, condemning foreign DSTs and how they harm businesses. And you mentioned a couple of times that there are ways we can push back. And I wonder if you might just specifically suggest some ideas that you might have as to how to do that. I mean, obviously you mentioned relative to other circumstances, the use of 301. Do you have ideas on specific ways, other than just raising the issue, specific techniques or mechanisms that we might be able to use to push back, particularly in this issue that we're having with Canada?
Thank you. No, that's a key issue, particularly because Canada's tax is retroactive, so they're going to try to get as much money out of that as possible. I think Canada, to me, is different than Europe because I think we have a lot more leverage. I think I'm born in Canada, I'm a dual citizen, and Canadians—
I live on the border, they're friends, but we do have our issues.
They know more about our politics than I think we do sometimes.
I think that's true.
They're very sensitive to being friends with us. So I think we have a lot of leverage if we were strong and pushing back and there was a leader-to-leader meeting and saying, no, if you do that, we can't. If that doesn't work, I mean, one of the ideas that I laid out in the testimony is an idea from Gary Huffbauer, I think at the Peterson Institute, which would be to pass a law that would allow us to tax their companies in the same way. I guarantee if we were to do that, we would get their attention immediately. They think they can get a free lunch out of this with no penalties to their own companies. Whereas I think if we said, you do that, we're going to tax a bunch of your companies that are doing business in the U.S.
Thank you, Doctor, and I really appreciate the testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. You know, a week ago, I led our U.S. Innovation Tax team to a listening tour of what some people call Silicon Valley, others call Tech Valley in California. While our focus was on encouraging innovation through sound, stable tax policies, it didn't take long for the discussions to also include intellectual property, the theft of the intellectual property, and extraterritorial foreign taxes. Bad policies like the TRIPS waiver and forced tech transfers disincentivize small startups and major corporations from innovating, testing, and developing and manufacturing here in the United States. And they counter the good policies that we could restore or strengthen, like immediate research and development expensing and the foreign-derived intangible income, or FDII. Excuse me. The TRIPS waiver has put us on a slippery slope. We now have countries at the WTO proposing more forced tech transfers, localized operations, and data localizations. In short, the complete abandonment of U.S. digital trade priorities. As one startup told me, it's easy to get a shop set up or to move research and development to another country that has more favorable policies as opposed to punitive ones, and that's not good for our country. Policies that hurt innovation hurt all Americans because they slow the economy, reduce jobs, and give foreign adversaries a competitive advantage. Another major area of concern, as we've talked about before, is the digital services taxes, or DSTs. We've witnessed countries like France and Canada specifically target U.S. companies to fill their coffers with these disastrous extraterritorial taxes. One company I talked to used the phrase, it's a bold grab of U.S. money, and it's costing Americans billions of dollars. Dr. Atkinson, OECD's Pillar 1 was supposed to provide clarity and stability around DSTs, but instead the Biden-Harris negotiators have put America last, and as we've talked about earlier, DSTs are proliferating. How do we, I know Mr. Kildee had asked some about other provisions we can do, but are there some equitable offsets to discourage foreign countries from thinking they can get away with transferring U.S. dollars? When you mentioned taxes, are there other things that we could do as well?
Thank you. I think the first thing to recognize is that Pillar 1 is basically institutionalizing DSTs. That's all it is. Pillar 1 says you can do a DST, you just have to do it according to these rules. If your profit rate is above 10%, we get to tax 25% of those profits, but only for certain size companies, even if you... So I think the U.S. administration and Congress needs to come out and say, no, there's no logic behind Pillar 1. The OECD says the logic behind Pillar 1 is because now we're trading things across borders that we didn't trade before in services. Well, by that logic, we should be taxing any company that sells anything in the U.S., even though they don't have an operation here. So I don't know, maybe there's some French water that comes across the border. Well, we should tax Perrier. I mean, there's no logic behind why you would single out digital. So I think again, we have to do two things. One is I like that idea of mirror taxes. Fine, you're going to do that. We're going to tax you, and we're going to tax you just as much, if not more. We need to make it clear that they can't take U.S. taxpayer money. I think the second thing would be there's a whole set of things we can do around trade enforcement that we should say, fine, you're going to do that, we'll do this. And I think at the end of the day, it's just a power play. We have to show that we're not going to let them take our money.
Yep. Mr. Shahbaz, for years we've had major concerns about CCP stealing intellectual property. As we've talked about advancing technologies such as AI, are you concerned about China and that they'll continue to ransack our intellectual property and why it's important for tech like this to be fostered in the United States instead of in China?
Thank you for the question. We are concerned about generally the Chinese Communist Party and the government's influence here in the United States, the ways that it conducts espionage, transnational repression, as well as malign political influence. That's where we think it's incredibly important to do two things. One is to stand up laws that essentially promote resilience here in the United States, resilience for companies, resilience for individuals who may face attacks from the Chinese government and its affiliates. And we also do think that it's incredibly important to show why technologies that are developed in the United States and why the United States governance system is very different to that in China. I think that's an incredibly important message that also sells well to our partners in other countries around the world, those in other markets that are looking to goods. They want to understand why it is that they should be purchasing U.S. technologies rather than those that are manufactured in China. Obviously, there are some economic considerations where perhaps they may be going for the technology that is the cheapest. But I think that's where the United States can play on its competitive advantage as a democracy to show that, well, listen, our technology isn't stealing your data. It's not, when there's a smart city that is built by Huawei in Africa or other technologies where Chinese companies are developing the infrastructure, there have been reports that data is being slowly trickled back to China so that it can be used for Chinese intelligence purposes or for corporate espionage. So I think it's very important for U.S. companies to show that that's not part of the game. What differentiates U.S. companies, and this is what I'm arguing we should be promoting, is that we're going to be safeguarding your data. This data is going to be under the oversight of of the strictest cybersecurity safeguards. That, I think, is how we differentiate ourselves from the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the witnesses. I know there's a lot more I'd like to discuss, but just to close out, I do think that government, both in Congress and administration, needs to actively defend U.S. innovators and job creators against these assaults. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. I now recognize Ms. Miller from West Virginia.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Blumenauer. And thank you all for being here today to talk about this important issue. I've already heard several of our close allies mention specifically Korea may soon pass online platform laws and regulations that would make it difficult for our U.S. companies to operate in their country. And I'm very concerned that such an important strategic ally like the Republic of Korea is pursuing economic policies that target and discriminate against U.S. technology companies while welcoming state-owned Chinese companies with open arms. Chinese firms are the fastest growing tech companies in Korea, with many leveraging strategic partnerships with Korean monopolies who have a strong influence in Korea's legislature. And as a result, there are proposed bills and regulations that would inadvertently grant Chinese players an advantage over U.S. firms, supercharging the growth of China's own national champions in Korea. The U.S. is holding up our end of the technology alliance by providing Korean companies billions of U.S. taxpayer funds in the form of CHIPS grants and EV and battery subsidies. I just kind of find it really concerning that the Korean government is in turn treating American interests in this manner, and I'm concerned about the national security implication of the ill-advised economic discrimination and would urge them not to go down this path, but instead continue our important technology partnership and the goals that are established in our free trade agreement. Our trade agreement with Korea is the second largest free trade agreement by trade flows, second only to the USMCA. It is extremely concerning to me that our two biggest FTAs are both facing obstacles in the world of digital trade. And I'm planning to introduce legislation that focuses on the strength and importance of the United States and the Republic of Korean alliance, with the intention to stop the Korean government from implementing these blatantly discriminatory laws that will cause an unnecessary irritant to such a vital relationship. And I do look forward to working with the committee to pass this type of important legislation. Dr. Atkinson, would you please explain how China wins should Korea pursue economic discrimination policies against the United States? And why are Chinese firms seeking to drastically increase their Korean user base? And do you believe that Korea is assisting them in their growth?
Thank you, Congresswoman. One of the key things about Korea, I spent a lot of time in Korea. They invite me over to talk and the like. And the last time I was over there with my family, I tried to use Google Maps to figure out where to go, and I can't. I could use a Korean app company, which actually I had to do. I had to download. And they say it's national security. It has nothing to do with national security. It's the fact that they wanted to favor their own domestic map companies, their own domestic players. That's what they're doing now by copying the European DMA. And what they want to do is they want to be able to pass a law that would require American companies to turn over data, to be interoperable, to do other kinds of things that would benefit Korean companies. But they can't write the law so blatantly that admits that. So it would benefit Korean companies, but it would also benefit Chinese companies. And so they're willing to make that trade-off because they think it's going to benefit their companies more. It'll hurt our companies. So it's almost like getting attacked not directly. So they're not trying to benefit Chinese companies. They're trying to benefit Korean companies. But you're absolutely right. This will benefit Chinese companies and make them stronger. I would put Korea again in the same category as I'd put Canada. They need us a lot more than we need them. They're dependent upon us, not just for military, but they're so focused right now on building technology partnerships. I just spoke at 2 conferences here that the Korean government put on. They want technology partnerships with us. And we're going ahead and saying yes. But I think there has to be a quid pro quo with that. Yeah, we want technology partnerships with you so we can both be stronger against the Chinese, but we're not going to do partnerships with you if you do these kinds of discriminatory things.
What are the national security concerns related to U.S. foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific should the U.S. be less economically tied to our strategic ally as they grow closer to China?
So the fundamental question, I think, in the Indo-Pacific is, are these countries going to gradually move over into the China orbit, or are they going to stay in the Western democratic market orbit? And we're going to know that in 20 years. That'll be decided. And by letting the Koreans sort of have it both ways, the Koreans don't want to pick. They want to have really close relationship with the Chinese because they know Chinese are predatory and retaliatory. They will hurt the Korean companies. They've done that before. But we need to let them know that they can't have it both ways. They have to pick. We're their defender. They need to be on the side of the allies and democracy. So I think it's a critical issue that we make them choose and choose us.
Thank you. I guess I need to yield back my time. I'm not finished, though. Thank you.
Well, we'll try to circle back around if we can. I now recognize Ms. Delbeni for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for being here. This is a really important conversation. Ever since I arrived in Congress, I've been advocating for a federal consumer data privacy law. Every day, millions of Americans' personal information is at risk, and we have to put people back in control of their data. And this has been crystal clear in debates around reproductive health data, TikTok, AI, and on and on and on. Ambassador Tai has maintained that one of the reasons the U.S. has paused digital trade talks is that they may limit the policy space needed to address domestic policy issues like privacy. Her argument is that by entering into digital trade agreements, the U.S. is giving up its ability to regulate domestically. That said, if we step back from the negotiating table until Congress acts, we run a serious risk of harming the very objectives, such as defending American companies, protecting privacy, and supporting a free and open internet that have been core to U.S. policy for many years. So, Mr. Razis, I guess I'll start with you. Does the U.S. entering into trade agreements prevent Congress or the administration from legislating or regulating on important issues domestically?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. In short, no. We don't see any tension between privacy protections and strong digital trade rules. Many of the privacy frameworks either that have been proposed here, and we agree federal privacy reform is long overdue, or one of the 19 comprehensive state bill laws that have been enacted have no tension with either USMCA or the US-Japan agreement. That's because those laws or bills don't enact data localization requirements. They don't restrict the free flow of transfers of information. And importantly, within USMCA, there's a pretty clear language that if there should be any tension in the future between domestic regulation and international trade agreements, US law prevails.
Thank you. And I don't think other nations take the same approach on their own either, which also puts us in a weaker position if we aren't moving forward. I also wanted to talk a little bit about intellectual property. Obviously, protecting intellectual property, our intellectual property from adversaries and competitors is essential to keeping our edge and protecting the livelihoods of small business owners across the country, and that's why the U.S. has historically opposed forced source code disclosure as a condition of doing business in a trading partner country, and we included this protection in the broadly bipartisan USMCA. Dr. Walch, how would you respond to a requirement to disclose your company's source code to a foreign government as a condition of doing business?
Thank you so much for the question. We would just leave. Part of it is because there's data in our backend that was collected in very carefully controlled IRB-approved studies on human subjects in the US. Those people consented, and we protect that very carefully. It's also our edge. It's what gives us a head start globally. If we had to disclose our models and somebody could just take them and skip all of the work we did and also have access to models trained on US citizen data, that would be just a no-go. It almost certainly would not be worth it for a company of 6 people, like my company, to operate in a place that requires us to give up our secret sauce.
And of course, if your source code was exposed, as you said, others could potentially access that too going forward.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I think this is another conversation when we talk about kind of the policies we need to put in place to make sure we're in a strong position. Privacy, obviously, critically important, important that we move domestically, but also looking at issues to make sure we're protecting IP are going to be important too. I just want to thank all of you for being here on this important subject. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize Ms. Fishbach for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And it seems like every time we discuss the Biden-Harris administration's actions on the world stage, we hear the same thing. The Biden administration keeps walking away from discussions where America's voice is needed and we should be an active participant. I hear it from agricultural producers across my district. I hear it from manufacturers in my district. And today, we're here to talk about the administration's failure to protect U.S. interests in our digital economy. Foreign governments seem to recognize that our current administration will do little to respond to measures that explicitly or implicitly discriminate against American companies. In some cases, government agencies like the Federal Trade Commission are even sending American officials to help implement policies that directly undermine America's leadership and innovation. Mr. Atkinson, what sort of impact does that have on other countries considering similar barriers?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Historically, if it wasn't for U.S. leadership, the world economy would be vastly more protectionist, be vastly more distorted, because it's been U.S. leadership that's been, if not explicitly, then implicitly holding up countries to a higher standard. They know that if they do this, they're sinning. And nobody really wants to sin. At least you don't want to admit you're sinning. And so the fact that the U.S. has led in all sorts of areas, we led in telecom deregulation globally, we led in IP, we led in digital, that did lead a lot of countries both to resist doing bad things, but also to say, wait a minute, if the U.S. is doing this and they're the leaders, maybe we should be doing that as well. And what's so troubling, I think, about USTR's decision, and by the way, I would add, that was really a unilateral decision. Both state and commerce, in my understanding, did not support that decision. Both the State Department and the Commerce Department were surprised by that decision and did not agree with that decision. So it's not as if the entire administration has backed away, although that is the de facto the case. So by us not pushing forward and insisting that these countries abide by these new rules around digital, we're basically sending a message that gives them carte blanche ability to go ahead and do whatever they want, because they know that we're not standing up for that anymore. And if we're not standing up for it, why would they bother to take the political risk in their own countries to stand up for that?
Thank you very much. Mr. Razis, why is it important that the U.S. not only defend policy provisions that are beneficial to our digital companies, but how can we do a better job in shaping the vision?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I think we can start by continuing to export gold standard rules like those we find in the USMCA and the U.S.-Japan Digital Trade Agreement. But there's even maybe a more basic step that can start, which is using the National Trade Estimate, for example, in order to catalog data localization requirements and other digital trade barriers that U.S. exporters face. Now, historically, the NTE has been a really valuable tool for not just U.S. businesses and policymakers for understanding the data localization requirements and other barriers that foreign countries have enacted, but also for sending a signal to our partners that these sorts of practices are unacceptable. Unfortunately, the most recent NTE, I think we saw about 70% drop in the data localization requirements that were referenced and about 80 barriers that were removed from the report altogether. Now, unfortunately, those barriers didn't disappear. They're still there, and they're still challenging U.S. exporters. So I think even a basic step, such as fulfilling the congressional mandate around the National Trade Estimate, would be a good place to start.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Walch, I'm so sorry, I'm running out of time, but you talked a little bit about, I believe with Mrs. Delbeni, about, what would happen with the overregulation, and I just was wondering if you had anything to add to that. She was, I think, asking specifically about some things, but I was generally with this overregulation, what does that do for your company?
Thank you so much for the question. So we are a team of 6. I don't have an in-house lawyer, and every time I talk to my external legal representation, I'm watching the clock. Overregulation means that we will rely on him even more, and that's a big burden on us. It is not a big burden on the likes of Google or Meta. They are drowning in lawyers.
Thank you very much, and we made it. I had 2 seconds left. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Sanchez for 5 minutes.
Thank you to Ranking Member Blumenauer and Mr. Chairman for holding this important hearing. I represent part of Los Angeles County, and obviously it's a large creative and technology industry hub of Southern California. And I'm very committed to ensuring that our trade policy uplifts U.S. digital businesses and the workers that support them. Digital has to be part of our engagement with our trading partners. And I also recognize that our trade policies need to be modernized. We can't just rely on the same old trade models that we've been using for decades. I think our digital trade agenda should consider how foreign adversaries like Russia and China manipulate and weaponize American data to harm our democracy. And we also have to consider how AI and automation reshape the workplace as well. There's a lot of moving parts to this. For instance, while robots have long been used in high-wage markets, we now see them in more lower-wage ones. And a study by the ITIF found that China's manufacturing sector, for example, uses 12 times more robots than that of the United States. And that's not driven by market forces, but it's driven by the Communist Party's generous subsidies. And that puts our American manufacturing and our American manufacturing workers, which already face an uneven playing field, at a disadvantage, a bigger disadvantage in global trade. So with the rise of new technologies, we need to ensure that our policies prioritize American workers instead of leaving them behind. Mr. Gottwald, in your written testimony, you touched on the importance of protecting the economic security of the more than 5 million workers in the creative industries, such as motion pictures, television, and music, which I always say our biggest exports is our American culture. Can you expand on how digital trade policy can better ensure that these workers get the compensation and the recognition that they are due?
Thank you, Congresswoman Sanchez. This is a great question, and it raises very important issues for our union creative professionals, many of whom earn collectively bargain pay and contributions to their health insurance from the sales and licensing of the copyrighted works that they help create. So intellectual property rules are quite important for these workers, their union members, their affiliated AFL-CIO. So a worker-centered digital trade policy, has to extend and address the stolen or unlicensed use of copyrighted content on digital platforms, and avoid replicating the outdated and overbroad copyright safe harbor exclusions that exist in some U.S. laws. So one is, let's not do further harm by exporting that model, which isn't working here. And in addition, they need to address the dangers and downsides to AI that you mentioned, including image-based sexual abuse, misappropriation for commercial gain, and the proliferation of deepfake videos and other abuses that happen and affect these creative professionals. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Atkinson, the U.S. film, television, and streaming industry supports over 816,000 jobs in California and about $101.7 billion in wages. And I'm particularly concerned that some of our closest trade partners are proposing measures that would discriminate against U.S. creative industries. For example, Australia may require U.S. streaming companies to invest 10% of their revenues in Australian content, and Canada wants U.S. streaming companies to subsidize local Canadian news production. These policies could negatively impact my state's and our country's creative industries and the broader U.S. economy. Could you offer, in the closing seconds that we have, some insight into how these mandates conflict with Australia and Canada's FTA obligations to the United States?
Thank you. I wouldn't use the word would, I would use the word could. I would use the word would. I don't think there's any question that we'll have less investment in our creators because of these rules, because of these tax grabs. Both of our trade agreements should be able to address that. And again, it requires a USTR that's willing to first go over there and negotiate tough with in their back pocket to say, we're going to bring a case. Under USMCA arbitration, we could bring a case. Under the US-Australia, we can bring a case. We just have to let them know that we're not going to do this. By the way, I did one other thing where I think I agree with my colleague from the AFL-CIO. We need to make sure that the trade agreements that we have protect creators and allow for site blocking, which is something we've long supported, that we should not allow these foreign websites that are basically pirate sites to be accessible here, and we should have our trade agreements encourage that with other countries as well.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And now recognized from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. Razis, if I could with you, as it relates to Workday, I understand your company helps to find and hire workers. Can you talk about how Workday helps U.S.-based companies compete globally by providing them with tools to recruit and manage talent across the borders in a competitive digital trade environment?
Congressman, thank you for the great question. Workday's business is to help other businesses do well. And so when our customers succeed, we succeed. In terms of specifics around talent management, a thing that we're very excited about at Workday is a skills-based approach to talent. And so we are leveraging AI and other digital technologies to help our customers understand what skills that their existing workforces have, what skill gaps there are in their current workforce that they can grow and help their workers identify, be it in manufacturing, be it in retail or other sectors, and then to identify new sources of talent as well. And so when our customers are able to leverage Workday products and the AI, especially that is driven there, they are better situated to adapt to new changes in the labor market.
Thank you. If I can follow up, maybe, can you talk about how current barriers and regulatory challenges like the digital service tax affect Workday's ability to invest in innovation and workforce development here in the United States?
Of course. So while the digital services taxes are addressed at companies that tend not to be Workday, so we're a business-to-business enterprise, and so rather than a consumer-facing one. That said, it speaks to a larger problem and the costs of foreign trade barriers. So in order to overcome a market access barrier like a data localization requirement, that requires time and money that could otherwise be invested in additional headcount or innovation, and that is, again, that comes with economic costs in addition to the variety of other costs associated with market access barriers.
Thank you. I appreciate the fact that all of you have 5 minutes to make statements, and your written statements are maybe longer than that. If I could, Dr. Atkinson, with you, because you had a very thorough written statement. Maybe if I can ask you about U.S. Trade Representative Tai's decision to withdraw from, as you say, key digital trade negotiations at the WTO. Can you explain why she did that, why she withdrew from those negotiations, and does it make any sense to you?
So I have not talked to Ambassador Tai, so I will only give you what I can see sort of from the outside. I think there are two factors. And I would add, by the way, I think in the Biden administration, there are forces on sort of the more openness to trade, and there are forces on the less openness to trade. This is not an administration that has one view. I think that's a challenge. As I said, there are folks in commerce who are really pushing for this. There are folks at state who are pushing for this. I think there are two forces. I think that Ambassador Tai and certain people in the administration, they talk about putting a pause on trade opening and having a middle-class-oriented trade and worker-centered trade. I don't think pause is I think pause is a euphemism. I think what they want is a moratorium, if not a rollback. And they see digital as being this expansive new area, and I think in their view, if they can stop digital trade or slow it down, this would all be good. Now, why do they want to do that? Because there's no question that trade puts limits on our ability. So, for example, we can't tax corporations at 80% because we could do it for domestic companies, they just raise prices, but for our companies that are trading, if we raise taxes super, super high, they would lose global market share. They would cut workers. So globalization puts, as Tom Friedman once said in his book, they are golden handcuffs. They do limit what we can do domestically, not in any legalistic sense, but if we wanted to sort of impose really terrible regulations, they do that. So I think that's point number one. I think point number two is there are certain progressives in the Senate in particular who really, really have an animus towards large corporations. They want to sue big corporations. They want to break them up. And they have this narrative that the U.S. economy has become increasingly concentrated, which is 100% false. And I'm happy to share that data from the U.S. Census Bureau that shows that simply is not the case. But in any case, they're having a real animus and a jihad almost against large corporations and big tech in particular. And I think this was the view, well, if we go down this path, we're going to limit our ability to break up Google or break up Facebook or sue them. So I think that was the two components of the logic.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Panetta from California.
Outstanding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I had an opening, but I want to follow up on that statement, that eloquent statement. Thank you, Mr. Atkinson, for that statement. But I mean, what about like when it comes to global leadership? Does the fact that U.S. participation, or lack of, does that also create a vacuum in global leadership, especially when it comes to digital trade rules that could be filled by policies proposed by other trading partners such as Russia or China?
Absolutely, absolutely, Congressman. The Chinese have obviously they have a different vision of governance and government and global governance, and they want to impose their vision and their system on the world. And I think Russia is sort of their sidekick, if you will. And this is basically a battle for influence. I've been in countries where the State Department has invited me in, and I see the role of China in these countries. I see China way more active in these countries than we are. So by us walking away, we're essentially giving the Chinese a green light for them to go into these countries and say, hey, look, our system is better. I've talked to Chinese companies who say one of the things that they're really selling, if you will, is we can go in there and give you a turnkey system in an African country that they call safe cities. Well, what they mean by that is complete total monitoring, complete data collection, be able to put people into jail for whatever reason you want, and they're selling that system. Yeah. Where are we? Where are we? Why aren't we in that country saying, by the way, if you do that, it's going to hurt your innovation, and by the way, it's against human rights. So I 100% agree with you.
Exactly. Mr. Shahbaz, where would you be on that statement?
I do think it's critical, and I would say that there's two parts to this. So thank you for the question, Congressman. On the one hand, we do need to make sure that there isn't a vacuum. We do know that the Chinese Communist Party has invested quite a bit, and there was a point where almost a majority of UN agencies were led by Chinese nationals. So I think it's very important, and it's been great to see the effort that was made, for example, to ensure that it was an American citizen who beat, I believe it was either a Russian or a Chinese national to lead the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. I do think it's great as well that we've stood up now the Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Policy in order to make sure that the United States is active at multilateral fora and through bilateral relations to make sure that we are making the case. And then I do think the second point here is what it means domestically. And I think that this has been something that has been pointed out by the other witnesses, is that we need to make sure that our foreign policy is also aligned with our domestic policy. And that means that people don't think of the United States as a place that is this kind of anarchy, right? Because I do think that there is this impression that some of the harms that have come about inevitably from digitalization haven't been adequately handled by by domestic regulation or whatever it might be, or by companies in some ways. So I do think it's important that the U.S. leads also through a domestic framework that protects rights of Americans, whether that's on privacy, whether that's on ensuring greater transparency. Because on the other hand, you do have China that, while all of their legislation on personal data, helps for domestic surveillance, they are selling that as a great way of protecting privacy for Chinese citizens. So I do think it's important that the United States leads with a rights-respecting vision, and that is the counterweight to what China is offering. Thank you.
Outstanding. I'm going to yield back the remainder of my time. One, because we have votes. I want to give other members time. Two, because those two statements, I think, say it all. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, and I recognize Mr. Stubbe for 5 minutes from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the Industrial Revolution to the Digital Revolution, America has been the beacon of creativity and technological innovation and advancement. But this leadership is at risk from policies both at home and abroad. The Biden-Harris administration's abdication of leadership on this issue has been appalling, and I do not have confidence that Kamala Harris' very detailed policy proposal of joy will be good for American digital competitiveness. Across the globe, including from our allies, we see bad actors stealing our intellectual property, implementing protectionist policies, stifling data security and privacy, and imposing unreasonable barriers that disadvantage American companies. It is essential that we establish and enforce robust digital trade rules to protect American companies, both large and small, from unfair digital practices overseas. Under the Trump administration, strong progress was made on digital trade in the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. The USMCA took important steps on e-commerce, algorithms, cybersecurity, cross-border data flow, prohibiting data localization, and consumer protection. It is important to have strong digital policy. It is equally important that the executive branch enforce these agreements and Congress provide rigorous oversight while responding to the need of policy changes. I applaud the efforts of Chairman Jim Jordan, who I sit with on the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, to engage with the European Union, which is attempting to impose its own censorship regime on American citizens and companies. The EU is pushing authoritarian policies that will interfere with the American democratic process, and the Biden-Harris administration is turning a blind eye, perhaps because it will help them politically. The EU's ever-expanding regulatory censorship effort seeks to impose censorship based on what an European official may deem to be, quote, harmful or disinformation. Failure to comply with the European authoritarians would impose significant fines on American companies that could amount to billions of dollars. Mr. Atkinson, can you talk about the censorship and anti-competitive practices that the EU is imposing on American companies?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. There's no question that the EU has a different standard of speech than the United States does. And we see that now in Britain, where there have been people who've been prosecuted in the last 2 months for simply making posts on social media that are legal, but not favored by the government. We would, I hope, never do that in the United States. We have a tradition of free speech. I forget who said it, but the best, I think it might have been Justice Brandeis, the best disinfectant is more sunlight. The answer to hate speech is free speech. One of the problems with that regime is that the Europeans don't really have digital platform companies. And so if they're going to go after companies for doing this kind of thing, they're going to go after American companies by default. And what's most troubling about that is the massive fines that they can impose. They could essentially bankrupt an American company if they wanted to for just allowing speech that's legal in our country. And by the way, I would add this another component is one of the key things about speech on the internet is American companies, by and large, I mean, maybe with the exception of X because they have a different view, which is their view, that's fine. But the other American platform companies, they do try to respect domestic rules about speech. And so it's not like they're saying, oh, we're not going to monitor or filter any speech in Europe. They're doing the best they can. And we can argue whether we like that or not, but they're trying to comply with those rules. And the fact that they can be subject to such onerous fines for making a best effort, I find that quite troubling. It would be one thing if the companies were just thumbing their nose at the European, we're not going to abide by your rules at all, screw you. All right, but they're not doing that. They're doing the best they can, and it's an incredibly difficult process when you're seeing millions and millions of pieces of content on your site every day.
Mr. Razis, am I pronouncing that correctly? Under the Trump administration, we had a massive overhaul of U.S. trade policy. Can you talk about the effect of the USMCA that had on important areas of concern like data flow, data localization and algorithms?
Congressman, thank you for the question. USMCA, which we're certainly pleased to see the bipartisan support around USMCA and a lot of these disciplines, really is the gold standard. It's the 21st century rule book when it comes to the digital economy right now. And so, to your point, it safeguards the ability of companies to transfer data across borders securely. It prohibits data localization requirements, and it protects American exporters like Workday from arbitrary and discriminatory requirements to transfer source code or algorithms to foreign governments as a condition for market access. Workday has about 75% of its business based here in North America, and so we're certainly beneficiaries of USMCA. However, we're certainly looking to export more and to new markets and would benefit from the protections within USMCA and the US-Japan agreement.
Thank you, the witnesses, for being here today. My time's expired.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Schneider from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be quick because I know we have to get to votes, but I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. The expansion of digital trade and digital innovation has literally transformed every industry across our economy. As a result, trading digital goods and services has helped create jobs, expand opportunities for small and family businesses, and cultivate innovation in communities across our country. Just in Illinois, my state, the digital economy supports more than 300,000 jobs and represents nearly $3.7 billion in digital exports. The digital economy is an important part of our trade infrastructure, and the United States must remain a leader when writing the rules of the road for the future of digital trade. The expansion of digital trade in the digital economy has accompanied an international discussion around taxing the revenues and profits earned by multinational corporations. While the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, continues its work to reach a consensus on an inclusive digital services tax framework, individual countries have put in place unilateral measures to protect their tax base. Like many of my colleagues on this committee, as we've discussed today, I am concerned about Canada's decision to move forward with a digital services tax that unfairly punishes American companies. I applaud the Biden administration for standing up for American businesses and initiating consultations with Canada through the dispute settlement chapter in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. And I hope we can continue working together on this important issue. The U.S. must ensure that competing proposals that impact the digital economy do not undermine American workers, American businesses, or American national security. We cannot cede ground to our adversaries on digital trade. Instead, we should lead the way on global technology advancement. I am confident that we can find our seat at the table and work with our allies to establish strong, equitable digital trade standards that protect American leadership and innovation. And with that, I want to ask, well, I have three questions. I'm going to focus on one just for time. Mr. Atkinson, in my district, I'm home to many of the leaders in biopharmaceutical and bioscience sectors, what I call a life science corridor through my district. We lead the country, we lead the world. These companies are developing and deploying the next generation of innovative technologies. Can you discuss how strengthening digital trade laws can improve protections for intellectual property, specifically in the context of medical or life science innovation, and discuss the scope of impact if the United States does not provide adequate protections for this important industry?
Absolutely, in two ways. One is the biopharmaceutical sector is increasingly data-driven, as you know, using algorithms to develop new kinds of treatments and devices. And a lot of that is going to be cross-border. It's going to be taking patient data from various places. Again, totally anonymized. We have to make that point clear. They don't care the name of the data. They just need to know, does this person have heart disease? What are the indications? So number one, we need to be able to protect that. The other is this question of data exclusivity. It's particularly for biologics and large molecule drugs where the patent protection is different. We need to make sure that when we sign trade agreements that we have 12 years of data exclusivity, because what other countries are doing is they want less data exclusivity, a shorter period of time, so they can basically take the molecule that we've developed and then sell it in our market more quickly than they would otherwise when it expires. So both of those issues to me are critical.
Great, and I agree that it is critical. Like I said, we've talked a lot about Canada. We can talk more. We have other issues. This is a critically important issue for our country, for our national security. But in the sake of time, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back my time so we can get Mr. Feenstra in.
Thank you. I now recognize from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Obviously, we know that we lead the world in innovation when it comes to digital innovation. We also understand that we're seeing other countries impose intellectual property taxes on what we have. Germany has imposed a tax on intellectual property. Canada announced in June that it would retroactively impose discriminatory taxes going back 2 years. I mean, DST is absolutely at the forefront right now of being taxed. So my question is this, Mr. Atkins, do you see similar types of discriminatory taxes being applied towards Chinese companies or other countries? So, are we the only ones here?
So I don't think they've designed their systems explicitly to say, let's go after the Americans, partly because they would, there was that statement that an EU official made. It was one of those things you're only supposed to say in private, but he said it in public.
Exactly, yes.
Gave the game away.
Yes.
I think he regrets saying that now.
But it came out. It was real.
It came out, and it was very real.
Yes.
The issue is why it seems like it's coming at us is our companies are bigger and they're more successful. And so they set the thresholds where these regulations, where these taxes and other things kick in. They set the thresholds in a way that pick up a lot of American companies, but the Chinese are just not big enough in those markets yet. Gotcha. We're very big in Europe. We're very big in Australia. We're very big in Canada. The Chinese aren't yet. The Alibabas, the Baidus, and the like. And so, if they were big, they would get wrapped up in this. They're just not big enough. So it's a de facto attack on U.S. companies.
Gotcha. So we can do 301 investigations. We can do countermeasures. I get all that, but the administration, with Janet Yellen and Treasury, I mean, do you see any sense that they're standing up and fighting against these imposed taxes from Canada and from Germany?
I think there's some pushback in the negotiations with regard to Canada. I don't see it with regard to Europe, and I think it's a long-standing problem that the U.S. foreign policy establishment and government and the military establishment prioritizes foreign policy and military issues over U.S. economic competitiveness and technology competitiveness issues. Their view, in my opinion, is let's not rock the boat. There's this conflict in Ukraine. We're just going to turn a blind eye to this.
And that's shameful. We've become the piggy bank, literally the piggy bank, and really no one's fighting, for just fairness. That's all we want is fairness, and that's not happening. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding back. Thank you again to all of our witnesses. Sorry we have to run out of here because of votes, but I think we'll make it. Please be advised that members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you again.